Hey guys, so here's where we stopped last time. Hopefully this image is something you remember. It's familiar to you guys. This is not a pipe by Margaret. Just to give context to where we came from, we were talking about World War II, and we were talking about satire with the piece. Now, as we move through the 21st century and we start looking at the beginning of 1900s, one of the things that are happening this period, besides new technologies, besides understanding some science, there's also psychoanalysis, which is fairly popular at the beginning of the century. And out of psychoanalysis, this need to understand oneself, and especially when it comes to Sigmund Freud and um, looking at dreams as kind of windows into psychological problems, then there's a whole area of art that opens into looking at one's memories and dreams as inspiration. So that is surrealism. And Margaret's part of the surreal movement. Now, one of the cool things about Margaret is that he kind of counterpoints reality with surreality. So, for example, this thing in front of us, it says this is not a pipe. However, our first reaction to understand this object, it is a pipe, right? We can see the shape, the form, and all those things. And our reality of what we see, it's a pipe. But if we go further into the reality, like we did at the beginning of the semester, then we recognize that it's not. That it's just paint, and it's paint that has been organized or put together in such a manner that we can recognize that object from reality. But it's not the reality. So Margaret really plays with this kind of illusions that are being able to create with art, with paint, with material. So here we have it. Right after the First War, we have Surrealism. And I apologize if I said Second World earlier, but I meant to say First World. And as we're talking about Surrealism and the end of World War One, then we really need to talk about the specific artist. And his name is Max Ernst. So Max Ernst is a visual artist. And he fought in World War One, and he came back with what's called back then shell shock. Sorry, we contemporarily talk about it as post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So PTSD, basically. So he comes back with PTSD, and in his sessions with his psychiatrist, he discusses this. He talks about all these things he sees in his mind, right? All these monsters, all these things from war that just keeps hunting him. And in the therapist, in some way, kind of not in some way, but actually, looked at his past because he was a visual artist. He said, why don't you take your, skill and your talent and describe, excuse me, what this demons look like, what these things look like. So every time you dream about them, you see them, whatever it is, just draw them. And that's what he did. So he would keep large pieces of paper and drawing utensils and things like that. And whenever he was exposed in his mind to these things, he would draw them. And here's one of those kind of immediate drawings that he created from the images that he saw. This is towards the beginning of his therapy and at the beginning of this body of work. Max Ernst's works continue to evolve and they become much more precise and descriptive and detail on how those quote unquote monsters look like. But it's interesting that the more detailed they became, the less that he was exposed to those images. So eventually, he was completely freed from those experiences through his own therapy. Well, the therapy that was given to him using art or using the creative skills and using this way of pouring out through visual medium. Nowadays, we use art sometimes as a therapy, and Max Ernst is one of those that in history we can see clearly where art therapy definitely could be used for from some psychological therapies. All right, let's move on to the next one. And this one should be familiar to most of you. This is Frida Kahlo. So Frida Kahlo is also a surrealist, and in some ways similar to Max Ernst. Uh, Kahlo used her pain, her disenchantment with life in some ways to create her artworks. She saw in some ways, or she used art in some ways to create or recreate the life that she doesn't have and how to express that. So in many cases, you would see in her paintings herself in different scenarios that unfortunately she was not able to participate in. And the reason for that is if you guys know her history, Frida Kahlo had a really bad accident when she was very young. She was in a trolley accident, and one of the parts of the trolley basically pierced her and basically went onto her back through the front. Anyways, fortunately, back then, the kind of therapies that existed for that were not very good, require a lot of physical therapy, but also really invasive surgeries that were extremely painful. And she had them throughout her life. So because of that and many other reasons, she was not able to bear children. She was not able to travel much. She did travel to Europe and some things like that, but she was pretty limited because of the amount of surgeries, and eventually all of that caused her to be bedridden. So throughout her life, this despair of what her life could have been and what she saw her life to be like versus what her world was, and how to express that anger, that dislike with reality, and etc., is what gave us the kind of the fuel to create the imagery that you guys recognize as Frida Kahlo's work. So let's move on to the next and probably the most iconic of the surrealist artists, and that's going to be Salvador Dali. Now, I personally as an artist, I'm very connected to Salvador Dali for many reasons. One of the things that you see in this case, or in this image, which is pretty familiar to most people, which is the persistence of memory, right? Is that Salvador Dali did not want it to be completely anti Western. He really enjoyed the clarity and the rendition that some of the classical artists had when painting. So, he'd look at Renaissance paintings, he'd look at Baroque paintings, and even further back, and he really liked those techniques. And because of his body of work, he wanted to have that clarity kind of render through or push through to the audience. Now, don't get me wrong, he also worked with Cubism, he also worked with other areas of art as ways of experimentation or expansion of his own work. However, you would see that his large body of work is mainly much more towards this kind of classical approach of art making. Another reason why I connect quite well with him is that even though he did use his memories or his dreams as the base for his um, inspiration, every single element in here has a symbol or has a meaning. It's a symbol for something. And the reason why he did that in so many ways is because of his relationship with psychoanalysis. And he was friends with Freud, and he really took it by heart to what, a lot of the things that Freud and psychoanalysis were discussing, So everything in your dreams apparently, or not apparently, but in this kind of way of psychoanalyzing a human person, in a dream, in your dreams, everything has a meaning. It has a translation to real world. So in his paintings, just like in that kind of way of understanding the psyche, he painted, and not only did he paint it in that format, but he makes sure that he was very aware of where his dreams were and recreated quite a bit of those dreams, to the point that he would try to uh, lucid dream, or he would uh, wake himself up a specific period or moment when you can still remember your dreams very clearly. So all these kind of elements, and you can see that in his work. um, I don't want to go too deep into Salvador Dali. I read quite a bit and studied Salvador Dali uh, fairly extensively when I was in grad school. But I do want to point out a few of the things here that are pretty interesting, and most people kind of recognize about Dali, and it's just pretty cool to know. The first one, I think, and the most recognizable one for Dali is going to be this molten clock. And I really like the molten clock because honestly, the meaning behind it, or the what it represents, is actually something that we kind of experience every day. Now, I know that in the past probably you said the phrase time flies when you're having fun, or you cannot watch a pot of water boil, and those kind of things, and those are referential to time, and not only time but also referential to what's happening to you at that moment. So we all experience time depending on how enjoyable we are, and all these other things around us. So time is not as mathematical at instant, as precise as it should be, right? Our perceptions of time are different. So it basically molds to whatever situation is. Time kind of drips around each one of those moments, right? So if we were to have liquid time, this is a good way to physically or visually represent this kind of different experiences by different things at different times, right? So a molten clock is the best way to describe that. Time flies when you're having fun, or like I mentioned earlier, all these other ones. So it's not pretty difficult. It's not that big of a you know deep symbol of any sort. Another one that I use a lot personally in my own artwork, one that by studying him I kind of plucked out of his own body of work, not with exactly the same meaning symbolism exactly one to one, but I do love what the reason why he uses ants in his work, or even flies as well, but ants specifically. So why ants, and why the clock, and things like that? So pretty simple description of this. Ants, when he was a little kid, he saw a dead bat on the floor, and he saw the whole bunch of little ants were crawling around the bat. So Dali continued to come back to see this bat that slowly was being broken down, eventually until basically the whole bat was gone. So for him, ants were this kind of symbol, this place, this object, this thing that meant decay, or taken away, or things that are broken down, right? That disappears, or that breaks down something else, right? So here we have a whole bunch of ants on top of time. Well, I mean, it is not a secret, right? Time erodes everything regardless, right? So we go through time and things get old, get damaged, whatever, because of that time. So it's really, really cool, really interesting to see all those little elements of decay right on top of a clock. And so it's right here as well. So anyways, like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into it. I just want to give you guys some ideas on how to kind of look at Dali's work. When you're looking at Dali's work, everything, like I mentioned, has a meaning. And if you ever want to know what that meanings are, you just have to read a lot of Dali's books. Now, you also have to keep that in mind, that Dali was not an open book, pardon the pun on that one, about how clear he is about a lot of the elements. You would read one book where he says that one symbol means something, and another one, the same symbol may mean something slightly different. So you kind of have to take the overall, and there's a midpoint on everything, and it's still pretty interesting, but everything has a meaning. All right, let's move on. Oh, by the way, here's a painting, and this is also the moment. At the moment, one of the cool things about Dali's work is a lot of Dali's works are actually very small. We tend to picture them to be fairly large, but they are not. They're actually pretty small in most cases. Now he has some massive paintings, don't get me wrong, but the ones that we normally kind of uh, bring to mind when we hear the word Salvador Dali are tend to be fairly small paintings. Here's another artist, very much similar to Salvador Dali in regards to psychoanalysis and using dreams as a location for creativity or for bringing those kind of elements into life. Um, However, as you can see, and it's kind of clear here, is that the his approach is much more modern. His approach is definitely contemporary to this early 20th century, right? Unlike Dali, which was much more in the classical way of approaching, the subject matter, this one is not, right? So we have complete abstraction almost of the figures, the forms, all of these elements, and using color, line, texture, all those things very arbitrarily uh, to decompose the image or the shapes. So anyways, this one I really love a lot, especially the title. This is one of my favorite titles. It says "People at Night Guided by the Phosphorescent Tracks of Snails." Um, if you continue to study this image, if this was to be render the same level of detail as Dali did with his work, this will be almost kind of pseudo pornographic. So it's really, really interesting just to kind of read the elements from this abstract and kind of recreate uh, what imagery he's trying to portray. So pretty cool. Also, one of the things, and this is just kind of a side note, but I love, I have a lot of snails at home, and it's really cool to see the slime of the snails on top of the concrete. And if you're at night, because of that goo, that shine, you can see exactly where the snails crawled and or moved throughout the concrete. And every time I see that, I'm reminded of this specific image of especially because of the title. So if you ever do see that, hopefully you'll remember this artwork as well. All right, so let's move on. Unfortunately, if we're going through the 20th century, we're going to have to go through World War II. And World War II, unlike World War One, is extremely disruptive. Okay, World War II um, was really stopped art making in Europe almost instantaneously, because the centers of art were, Northern Europe, Germany. We have France, obviously Paris, and we have all, Spain. All of these locations were kind of the hubs of art, and with World War II, it completely disrupted that. So a lot of artists stopped making work, and some artists, unfortunately, were part of the victims of World War II. Some moved to the United States. Actually, quite a bit moved to the United States. So our work changed. Art was, not many were able to produce art. Um, Now we are going to talk about a few artists and some of the artworks that came through this time period. Not a lot, unfortunately. But I'm going to point out a few. So the first one I'm going to point out, and this one is not from Europe, but this one is from Mexico. This is one of the paintings by Diego Rivera. So this is Liberación de un Peón, which translates to the freedom of a worker, or yeah, basically that's kind of how it translates. Now, it is very well known that he was a communist. Now, communist for us has a really negative connotation. However, you have to understand that living in Mexico, right, in this time period, there was a very strong divide between those who were of the Spanish descent and those who were from indigenous backgrounds. There's a really big disparity. And those who were from Indian or Native American type of backgrounds, they were treated horribly, horribly, even though it was basically their land to begin with. So in this context, Diego Rivera saw communism as a way to unify in some ways, or to be fair, not so much unify, to be fair with those who were indigenous background, with the wealth that the white or the Spanish had accumulated. So through his painting and his murals, he always tried to portray that sense of equality or this equality to make it much more poignant to for people to recognize the problem. So like in this case, for example, we have, this individual who is quote unquote freed, right? So why is this worker freed now? Because he's dead, right? So he's no longer suffering, right? So, or it has been broken down to the point that he no longer creates problems. For whatever way you see it, this idea of the liberation being happening after you're broken or after you're dead, it's kind of the highlights that he was trying to point out regarding that division. Another artist that um, continue to make artwork, of course, not at the same speed and not speed, but quantity and ease as before, was Picasso. Nevertheless, he was very productive and he did quite a bit of work. However, one of the most iconic pieces of artwork by Pablo Picasso is a work of art that we already talked about in the semester, but it was completely unlike anything else that he had done. Now, it does look like his work, meaning it does have some of the formal elements that you kind of expect from a Picasso painting, which is cubism, abstraction, monochromatic colors, all of these other things that you kind of expect, right? However, the thing that makes it completely different from his body of work is that Picasso looked at the world through and his art through a lens of formal elements, line, color, texture, those, how to simplify the image and the work through those elements. Expression, emotion, those kind of things were somewhat part of his work, but it was very muted. It was kind of the last thing that he was really trying to convey with his artwork. Nevertheless, when he was asked to create a painting for the World Fair, and somehow address what was going on in Europe, he completely disjointed himself, in, well, not completely, but he disjointed some of those formalistic elements, or that division that existed between his formal elements and that expressionism, or the need to showcase emotion and connect emotionally with the audience, into this painting to talk about Guernica. So Guernica is very much an emotional painting, an expressionistic painting, a painting dealing with the tragedies, sorry, of World War II, especially with what happened in Guernica. And since we talked about what happened in Guernica, I'm going to move on. Another artist who also created a lot of work during World War II, and he was in some ways fascinated. It was Dali with Hitler and who Hitler was, and what was happening in Europe. Remember that he was very much into kind of the mind, the dreams, all of that. So he in some ways he wanted to see the reality of the world through all those elements, and he created all these artworks related to Hitler and World War II. Once again, everything in here has a meaning. There's a tear, there's a bat, there's a picture of Hitler, there are beans, there's a clock, there's this dog with the umbrella. All of these elements, and there's another umbrella here. All of these elements, every single one has a meaning. Okay, and I cannot go through all of them. You're welcome to do some research yourselves. One of the things that I want to point out is that Dali and Picasso were Spanish painters, so they were slightly isolated from World War II because they were under a different tyrant, right? So they were under Franco. So they were somewhat protected from the Nazis. So they were able to create artwork, and in a much more, I mean, stretching this in some ways, but calm community or moment than the rest of Europe had. All right, so let's continue on into the 20th century, and as you can see, we're getting to the end of modernism. So modernism, or modern art, and somewhere around the mid 1950s, 1960s, somewhere around halfway through the 19th century, through the 20th century. Um, and then after that, we get into postmodern, which is the era we're in. So color fields is one of those that's right there at the end of modern art. Well, one of the things to understand about modernism is that understanding what art is and the deconstruction or the displacement of the elements of art and the material from the bounds of the subject matter, right? So we no longer have the connection between, a painting has to be about a subject matter. A painting can just be paint because paintings are just paint, right? So that's what the ultimate outcome of modernism was. This kind of full awakening of understanding that separation. So, and the reason why I mentioned all that is because with color fields, we get to that point, right? We get to the point that we no longer need um, subject, right? So we have non-representational art, in other words, art that is completely about itself and nothing else by itself. So we've already talked about Rothko's before, but it's extremely important to know that when you're looking at a Rothko, you really do not want to be looking for any figurative or objective element in here. The only thing you're doing here is experiencing color. Now, the best way to experience a Rothko is to try to get, or not just a Rothko, but any of the color field paintings, is to try to get as close as you can to where most of the your field of vision is filled with the color. And then allow yourself to be honest on how you experience the work, right? How does it make you feel, right? How is the color combination uh, in some way index wise connecting with you, that emotion that's attached to it. Um, and and that's how you really want to analyze it, or you want to not so much analyze it, but understand the work. Now, the best way to see Rothko's paintings or any other color field artist is to see a lot of them side by side. A lot of times when you only see one, they tend to look pretty kind of thing because they're full of color, but that's it. You really don't get to experience a different sensation of color unless you are able to spend time with like 15 of them, because then you can actually compare and contrast your emotional connection between one set of colors to the next set of colors, which ones makes me feel more happy and one's more sad. And the other cool thing to me is that what makes you feel happy and sad may not be to the person that you're with at the museum or somebody else, and that's really, really interesting. Same colors, different experiences, different outcomes. Here's another one, right? This is another color field. Here we have two different sides of drips. Once again, there's non-representational art. The only thing you're seeing is color, right? And then you have two sides that you can experience, right? So this one tends to be more on the warm side of colors. This one tends to be more on the cool, um, and they're vertical. One has downward movement, the other one might have an upward movement. All these other things are happening there, but at the end, we're not looking for anything other than that automatic experience with the color, with the line, and all those things, those kind of things. And this one's also at the modern, so Morris Lewis's this painting is at the modern. So that's color fields. If you want to experience Rothko and you want to really approach it in the best possible manner, if you go to Houston, there's the Rothko Chapel. And in the Rothko Chapel, it's a non-denominational chapel where you can go in and you can pray, you can meditate, whatever it is. And in this space, which is semicircular or almost circular, basically, you're going to have a whole bunch of Rothko's paintings. You can spend a lot of time looking at those monochromatic paintings and allow yourself to experience the emotion that each one gives you. That is something that you can really, that it exists, it's free, whenever you're in Houston, and see if you can, really relate to those paintings. Give yourself the time to relate to the paintings if you want and if you can. All right. Another way of deconstruction that happens towards the end of modernism is assemblage. Now, assemblage is connected definitely to the Dada movement of the found object, but also connected to Picasso's deconstruction of the subject matter and then recreating it in a collage form, right? A cubistic form, in a non-expected format. And that's in some cases also the rest of abstraction. But in this case with assemblage, we have objects, right? So how do you, kind of abstract something you see by reconstructing it with different objects? So the way you do it basically is through a collage formal way. You take objects that are representative or similar and reconstruct them in such a way that you have the essence of what you've seen or what's in front of you, to recreate the moment or the image or whatever it is. So here we have a goat with a tire, we have a baseball, we have a few other things. And this is the same artist we saw at the beginning of the semester, where we had the door on top of the 4 wheels and the bucket, right? So it's kind of that simplification of a moment. Here we might have a goat on top of a truck, going by some kind of, I don't know, something like that. I'll let you guys put it together. Here's another artist, very much an assemblage artist that you guys need to recognize. This is Jasper Jones. Probably his most recognizable piece of work, the most famous one, is his flag series, where he has a flag and creates another one and puts it on top of it, and so forth and so on. So he has kind of multiple American flags, one on top of the other one. Here, right here, we have another one of his works. So it's target with 4 faces. Also assemblage. Abstract expressionism, that is really the end of modern art, and the complete detachment of the figure, and that gets us, obviously, as I mentioned before, into postmodern, or not the figure, but just the form, the figure, the subject matter, and here is pure expression. So everything you're doing here it's derived from expression. Now, it's still abstract, meaning that it is not completely non-representational like Rothko's paintings, right? Rothko paintings have absolutely nothing to do with the real world. This one, up to a level, it is still somewhat representational, just a tiny little bit, meaning when Pollock is painting these images, he has something in mind from the real world. So he's looking in his mind's eye to the way possibly a ballerina dances, or the essence of a flower pot, or things of that manner. And because he's using drips to convey those ideas, right? There's no paintbrush. Then he allows the paint to kind of just do whatever it does, right? And express all of that through how fast, how thick, how all of those things, through emotion that he can convey through the paint. One of the cool things about this specific artist, once again, possibly, but like Picasso, is that he got rid of something that a painter needs. In this case, he abstracted away, basically, in some ways, the paintbrush. Right? He no longer has the paintbrush directly on the canvas. He just kind of allows the drips there to be expressive and to allow you to understand what he's trying to convey. Now, color also, he adds color in many cases. And one of the cool things as well of Pollock is when you go into a show of his and there's 20, 30, 40 different Pollocks, you can start recognizing how figurative in so many ways, and how much of the subject matter you can see actually through the way that he drips or the way he applies the paint. And it's not until that moment that you recognize, that it's much more of an abstract than it is a non-representational piece of artwork. Now, when we're talking about abstract expressionism, right, we get to objects like this one. Now, personally, I am not a fan of abstract expressionism. I prefer much more representational artwork, like a lot of people in general. However, I can definitely understand and experience these artworks about what they are. So in this case, or for example, this is the Kooning, but also, for example, this one right here, right, by Basquiat, either one of those two, right? People will look at this and say, well, my 5-year-old can do it, right? This looks like a child did it. And in some ways, that is not an incorrect perception. The difference is how you approach that, right? So if you're dismissing it as this person not having any skill, you're dismissing it as not good art, you're dismissing it all those things, right? When you're saying, oh, this was painted or looks like a 5-year-old did it. The part that you have to really think about, right, is that as we discussed at the beginning of the semester, the most creative individuals in the world, period, are children. They're having to constantly be recreating, pushing the boundaries in order to understand the world so they can navigate through it, right? So for artists who are wanting to kind of describe the world through a completely creative manner, childlike application is the best possible way to kind of get to that completely raw creative energy, right? So it is extremely difficult for anybody to do that. I mean, I dare you to start a drawing, right, and of anything, and not erase it or not make it look like what you're thinking, right? Now take that, because take your own understanding of that, and then start thinking about an artist with, let's say, 20 years or 15 years of art education, where you've learned to really craft a skill to a very, very fine point, right? So it's extremely difficult emotionally, mentally, for an artist who's gone through all that training to divest themselves, to get rid of all that training and all of that, to try to find that spot, within yourself, to be able to be completely creative in a similar manner that a 5-year-old is creative. Now, the 5-year-old doesn't worry about all the training because he doesn't have any of that to kind of, uh, stop him or keep him confined. We as adults, artists as adults, we do have that. So it is extremely interesting to see this kind of artworks, right? And see them side by side and start thinking, wow, this specific artwork looks like a 5-year-old, and on top of that, it is very precise like a 5-year-old. Like there's a freedom to it that is extremely interesting. Now, that is how you experience this kind of artworks, right? The liberty, the moment, that allowing yourself to be kind of completely creative with the subject matter, the figure, whatever it is, in order to play it as raw and creative as possible. On top of that, like Basquiat, for example, he wanted to discuss social issues that were in some ways offensive, that talked about discrimination, talked about racism, talked about all those things. And for some reason, when it applied through this kind of simplified, childlike elements and application of the subject matter, right? This kind of simplicity, he's able to convey those ideas much simpler, right? By having all these simple elements and simplified shapes and forms, he was able to convey those ideas a lot more simpler. So this naivete, the simplicity, this painting like a child type of thing, it's applicable in certain cases, especially, well, not especially, but it's applicable. I'm gonna kind of stop in there. So that's Basquiat. So please, 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 next time when you see an artwork that you think, oh, a 5-year-old can do it, even though a 5-year-old can do it, they can't, because they are not a 30-year-old, painting like a 5-year-old. They don't have that that division. All right. Pop art is definitely a postmodern thing. So pop art, and what is pop art? And pop art is, as we mentioned before in the beginning, halfway through this kind of art history thing, did not started right here. Pop art kind of had its beginnings right at the middle of the Baroque. That's when you kind of first see elements of pop art. And pop art is basically artworks that are derived, they're looking at, they are inspired by, excuse me, uh, elements that are popular, right? That elements that things that people want to have, obtain, keep, anything that is popular and people want to obtain. So whether you want to obtain, like in this case, in this collage, right? We want the car, we want the latest vacuum cleaner, we want the TV, everything, right? Including the moon. Right, so anything you want, everything you want to have, and those things that are very, very popular, that is pop. Now, pop art is when you take those elements and you use them as inspiration to create something that is related to this culture of want. So here we have Hamilton. This is a very iconic image in the pop art. Andy Warhol, as we talked about him before, he is obviously a pop artist, and kind of reiterate a little bit what we discussed in the past. He used the iconography of individuals and other elements and discuss how the popularity or popularization the consumption of these elements degraded the original or the concept or the ideas and things like that. So Andy Warhol. Here's another one, another artist, and this is Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein also used pop art. His pop art was, he used comic books, kind of obviously by the image, as the inspiration to describe some of the things that he wanted to convey. Another pop artist, and this is another artist we've seen before. This is Claes Oldenburg. And Oldenburg, as I've said in the past, his work of consumption, his imagery was kind of creating a physical representation of the want, meaning that the more you wanted it, he made it bigger. Right. So when I say you, I mean kind of social want in general. Right. So if society wanted, for example, I don't know, trying to think, commodities like, let's say, a toothbrush, right? So he would create this really massive commodity toothbrush or plastic toothbrush to describe kind of the sense of that commodity. In here we have 2 cheeseburgers with everything, right? One's not enough, and this oversizing, overwanting of fast food kind of thing, right? This is very much consumption at its best. And as we get more towards the contemporary, right now, what's of the discussion of pop art, then we have, Kaws, for example, and we have all the artists who walk a line contemporarily between commercialism and art, right? Especially when we're talking about consumption, when we're talking about popularism and commercialism, all of those things kind of how and which point does does commercialism or those kind of elements cross into art and something art into commercialism. And Kaws is one of those beautiful examples of pop art where those boundaries merge back and forth between art and commerce. Really, really interesting. Minimalism is interesting because minimalism is when an artist allows or gives themselves a set of rules or a set of materials and create as many possibilities with that set of self-implied instructions as possible. right? So it's like creating a cake or different cakes using exactly the same ingredients, right? And a variation of the same ingredients. Um, and in this case, we have Donald Judd, and you'll see Donald Judd in most modern art museums. You'll see some of them. Since we live in Texas, if you ever make it to Marfa, he's got some really large installations on Marfa. Now he passed away, so he's not alive, but his work still is, and you can go see it. And you can definitely understand what minimalism is about. It's kind of study of the same thing over and over again, and all its possibilities. So here we have some of the main elements that he works with, which is light reflection, metal, and then this very specific kind of simplistic shape, which is you know a prism of sort, right? A rectangular prism. And you'll see these boxes, the steel boxes, in all kinds of different manners and different sizes and different elongations and things like that. So Donald Judd is a minimalist. So is Frank Stella. Frank Stella uses color, so all kinds of different ways that you can utilize color. Not so much paint, even though he's using paint, but color in so many ways. It's his media. It's like it's kind of this playfulness of flat color, and how many different ways can you reorganize the same, not the same flat color, but the colors, right? And playing with color, but flat color, right? Another artist that we've seen before that's part of the minimalist movement is Agnes Martin. Agnes Martin, towards the end of her life, was very much a minimalist. She had many philosophies, but one of the ones that she was kind of working towards is kind of the simplification and the beauty within things that are very, very simple. So you'll see a lot of her grids throughout a lot of the modern art museums. Another type of art that exists is conceptualism. Now, if you notice here in the PowerPoint, I have some that are grayed right here, and then this one, for example, is solid. The reason why they're grayed is because the popularity, let's put it that way, the strong movement of that specific kind of making of art happened during the time period that it's solid, right? It still is being made, right? So we still have pop art being made. We have abstract expressionism. We have all of these things still being made. Now we do have some surrealism, and obviously we have a lot of these other elements, but these ones are kind of the still strong ones contemporarily, but not in full bloom. Conceptualism is definitely a big part of our contemporary art discussion. Conceptualism is when the idea is the main media. The objects within the conceptual piece of artwork are important, but they're like puzzles to the overall, image, right? And you cannot get the image unless you kind of let it sink in and you find the idea. The idea really is the main media, the main thing in the center of the artwork. I love to show this piece right here, because it kind of contains some of the elements of the beginning of the semester when we're talking about beauty, right? Remember that I told you to close your eyes and think of chair, and then we talk about chairness. Well, here, this is kind of the same concept of beauty, right? Of the concept of reality, of truth, right? So what is a chair? Right? We have three different types of chair that is still really chair, right? So we have the definition of a chair, we have the actual chair, so we have an image of a chair. If you also wanted to think about it, this could be, the truth, right? The definition of chair, which gives you a sense of chair. Then we have the actual object in reality, which would be the first kind of breaking away from the truth. And then we have this copy of the original. So also kind of that distinction of the three kind of parting away from beauty. But nevertheless, this is talking about beauty. And honestly, if we look at all three of them, this is a beautiful chair. All right, good. Here's one of my other probably favorite artists, and we talked about one of his artworks in the past, Felix Gonzalez Torres. Torres, as I mentioned before, he's the same artist that did the two clocks. So he passed away of HIV complications. So did his partner, and during the whole time period, when created some of his strongest bodies of work, which I think are the strongest. But this one's one of my favorite because this is all candy. Let me see. Do I have an image of the candy? No, I don't. Candy, and part of the idea behind it is that the audience can grab the candy and you can take it with you. You can eat it in the museum, you can take it with you, you can give it away, whatever you want. The point is that as people take the candy, it slowly reduces the size of the installation until it finally disappears. Right? So what is this concept about? Well, if you know about the artist a little bit, then you recognize what this is about. So the candy, or let me start here. When the museum receives the instructions for this installation, it comes with instructions to buy candy. That's a specific candy from a specific manufacturer. And it tells them exactly the kind of amount that is meant to be placed on the floor or whatever surface they want, right? Now they can install it any way they want. You can install it in a wall piled up. They can install it like in this one right here. It doesn't matter. They just have to be laid out, and they have to allow the public to take the candy. Now, why the specific amount and why the specific candy? And that's where the information is very important for this artwork. The candy was his partner's favorite candy to eat. And the amount of weight is the weight of both of them, him and his partners, how much they both weighed before they got sick, right? So in some ways, as the audience takes the candy away, it recreates the slow decay of their bodies until they finally are no longer among us. So very strong conceptual piece of artwork. Why is it conceptual? Once again, because the idea is the most important thing. The candy disappears, the candy is taken away, and the candy really doesn't, I mean, it is representative, but it's not the artwork, right? In so many ways. The artwork is kind of this idea and the concept. All right. Last but not least, we get to neo-expressionism. So we have abstract expressionism, we got regular expressionism, we got neo-expressionism. So what is the difference between neo-expressionism and regular or abstract expressionism? Neo-expressionism is when you can use any material to create artwork in an expressive way, right? So expressionism and abstract expressionism mainly use paint, right? Neo-expressionism uses any material. So you have mud, you have plants. I mean, you name it, you have it, and it's all done with a essence or with a with the goal of creating an emotional connection between audience and the artwork. So that's really the only difference. And everybody, hopefully, from this class recognizes this artwork, right? So this is Ansel Kiefer, and he is very much a modern artist. This is a neo-expressionist. And then we get to the end of this, guys. So now we have the 21st century, and with the 21st century, we have a plethora of different ways of creating artwork. So what's next? What is the next kind of, art movement that we have going on? Is it going to be digital? Is it going to be, VR? We don't really know what's coming. But nevertheless, hopefully by this point you guys recognize that each one of those styles of artwork are different from the other one, that not all of them are just one big pile of code, that needs to be compare side by side, but rather compare within each own style and then see what makes each style different and appreciate it for what it is, right? And see and appreciate also the difference between one style and the other, not to be judged side by side, because then you don't find the beauty within each one. So Hopefully you guys liked the art history part of the semester, and don't forget to take your quiz, and hopefully you guys have had a good semester, and I'll see you hopefully in a Zoom meeting shortly.